The etched face of the town clock in Redemption showed 1:15, its hands frozen in the brassy glare of the sun. Dust, fine as powdered bone, settled over everything, coating the false-fronted buildings and the sweat-slicked flanks of tethered horses. Inside the First Redemption Bank, the air was still and smelled of stale paper and oiled metal. Nathan Cole stood before the teller's cage, his hat in his hands, his gaze fixed on the small, velvet-lined box on the counter. He felt out of place here, a relic of the open range, adrift in a world of ledgers and locked doors. He reached into the box, and his calloused fingers closed around the cool, familiar weight of a silver locket. It was tarnished with age, etched with the faint outline of a wild rose. Inside, a miniature portrait of his wife, Sarah, smiled out at a world she had left 7 years ago. Her eyes, captured in faded sepia, held a light that Nathan had spent every day since trying to forget and failing. This was his annual pilgrimage, a quiet ritual of remembrance on the anniversary of her death. He would take the locket ride to the lonely grave, marked by a single stone cross on the edge of his property, and sit with her until the sun went down. "Everything in order?" Mr. Cole, the teller, a young man with a pristine collar and nervous hands, asked. Nathan nodded, his throat too tight for words. He slipped the locket into his waistcoat pocket, the chain cool against his skin. It was as he turned to leave, his boots sounding unnaturally loud on the polished floorboards, that the world shattered. The bank's double doors flew open with a percussive slam that echoed like a gunshot. 5 men spilled into the room, their faces hidden behind dusty bandanas, their hands filled with iron. They moved with a predatory grace, a wolf pack descending on a fold. Panic erupted, a woman screamed, a man dove for cover, and the young teller's face went slack with terror. The leader stepped forward, a tall figure in a long black duster. He moved with an unnerving confidence, his silver-inlaid pistols seeming like natural extensions of his hands. He vaulted the counter with fluid ease, his boots landing silently on the other side. "Ladies and gentlemen," he announced, his voice a low, cultured drawl that carried an undercurrent of pure menace. "This is a redistribution of assets. Your cooperation will be rewarded with your continued respiration. Please place your hands where I can see them." His men were already at work, stuffing canvas sacks with currency, their movements practiced and brutally efficient. But the leader ignored the money. His eyes, cold and sharp above his mask, scanned the room and settled on Nathan. Nathan had remained still, his training as a cavalry scout kicking in, urging him to observe, to wait for an opening. But there was none. 2 of the outlaws had their guns trained on the cowering customers. The leader walked directly toward him, his spurs ringing a death knell on the floor. He stopped a foot away, close enough for Nathan to smell the trail dust and whiskey on his clothes. "Nathan Cole," the man said. It was not a question. The sound of his own name spoken by this specter of violence sent a chill down Nathan's spine. "I believe you have something that belongs to me." Nathan's hand instinctively went to his waistcoat pocket. The man's eyes followed the movement. With a flick of his wrist, he produced a pistol and leveled it at Nathan's chest. "The locket," he ordered, his voice dropping to a near whisper. "Place it on the floor. Slowly." Confusion warred with rage inside Nathan. The money, the bank, it was all a pretense. This was about him. This was about Sarah. "I don't know who you are," Nathan said, his voice a low growl. The man chuckled, a dry, humorless sound. "Oh, I think you do. You just don't remember. Some things, some people, are easier to bury. Now the locket." He cocked the hammer of his pistol. The click was the loudest sound in the silent room. Nathan's mind raced. He could draw, but the other men would cut him down before his gun cleared leather, and the innocents in the room would pay the price. Defeated, he slowly pulled the silver locket from his pocket and let it fall. It landed with a soft, metallic clink, Sarah's face now staring up from the dusty floor. The leader bent down, not with his hands, but with the barrel of his gun, and nudged the locket, flipping it over. He stared at it for a long moment before looking back at Nathan, a strange burning intensity in his eyes. Such a pretty thing, he mocked, scooping it up. A reminder of all that was lost, or perhaps all that was thrown away. He pocketed it, then nodded to his men. "We're done here." As the gang backed toward the door, their guns still covering the room, the leader paused and pulled down his bandana. His face was lean and weathered, marked by a jagged scar that ran from his left eyebrow to his jaw. But it was his eyes that held Nathan captive. They were filled with a hatred so personal, so profound, it felt ancient. "This isn't about money, Cole," he said, his voice laced with venom. "This is a reckoning. My name is Silas Kane, and when you see me again, you'll remember why you should have died at Black Creek." Then he was gone, vanishing into the sun-blasted street, leaving behind a terrified silence. The smell of gunpowder and Nathan Cole, a man who had just had his last connection to the past, stolen by a ghost he didn't know he was supposed to recognize. The name Black Creek echoed in the hollows of his memory, a place locked away behind years of guilt and self-imposed exile. The reckoning had begun, and Nathan was standing in the ruins of his carefully constructed peace. The ride back to his ranch was a journey through a landscape of ghosts. The sun bled across the horizon, painting the mesas in hues of blood and rust, a constant visceral reminder of the past he couldn't outrun. Every gust of wind seemed to whisper the name Silas Kane. Every shadow seemed to hold the man's accusing eyes. Black Creek. The name was a key, and Nathan could feel it turning in a lock he had sealed shut years ago. His ranch was less a home than a hideout, a small cabin and a barn, hunkered down in a shallow valley deliberately isolated from the world. He had built this life of quiet hardship as a form of penance, the daily toil a way to exhaust his body, so his mind wouldn't have the strength to wander back to the smoke and screams of his past. Now that fortress had been breached. The locket was gone, and with it the fragile peace he had mistaken for healing. He unsaddled his horse, the familiar motions automatic, his mind a maelstrom. He saw Sarah's face not as the serene image in the locket, but as she was in his last memory, her skin pale, her breath shallow, her eyes filled with a sorrow he had never understood. The doctors had called it consumption, a wasting sickness that had stolen her from him. But Silas Kane's words, all that was thrown away, planted a seed of doubt, a venomous vine that began to wrap around his heart. Inside the cabin, the setting sun cast long shadows that clawed at the corners of the room. The space was sparse, functional, containing only what a man needed to survive. A bed, a table, a stove. No pictures, no keepsakes. He had tried to erase his history, but it had come hunting for him anyway. A memory sharp and unwelcome broke through the fog. A cavalry patrol deep in Apache territory. Rain cold and relentless. He was a scout, young and confident, reading the land like a book. With him was another scout, a man he'd called a friend. Sergeant Elias Vance. A good man, quiet and steady, with a wife and daughter waiting for him back at the fort. Then came the ambush at Black Creek. A blur of chaos, gunfire from the rocks, said the screams of men and horses. He'd been wounded, knocked unconscious. When he came to the patrol, had been decimated. Elias was gone. Listed as killed in action, his body never recovered. Nathan sank onto the edge of his bed, his head in his hands. Could Silas Kane be Elias Vance? It seemed impossible. The man he knew would never lead a band of cutthroats. And yet, the eyes. Behind the hatred, Nathan had seen a flicker of something familiar, a shared history of fire and pain. The next morning, he rode back into redemption, the need for answers overriding his instinct to retreat. He found Sheriff Miller in his office, a man whose face was a roadmap of long years spent trying to keep the peace. Miller was old-weary and saw more than he let on. "Heard what happened at the bank," Nathan Miller said, pouring him a cup of black, bitter coffee. "Heard they were after you specifically." "They took my wife's locket," Nathan said, his voice flat. "The leader called himself Silas Kane. He mentioned Black Creek." Sheriff Miller's posture stiffened. He set his coffee cup down with a deliberate click. "Black Creek. That was that massacre with your cavalry unit, wasn't it? The one you were the sole survivor of." "There were a few others," Nathan corrected, though the lie tasted like ash in his mouth. In truth, he was the only one who had walked away with his mind and body mostly intact. "You planning on going after him?" Miller asked, his gaze steady. "Because that's a fool's errand, Nathan. Kane and his crew are ghosts. They hit hard and vanish. They're not just bank robbers. They're killers." "This isn't about the money," Nathan stated. "This is personal." "Vengeance is a fire that burns the man who holds it," the sheriff warned. "You built a quiet life for yourself out there. Don't tear it down, digging up old graves." "The graves are already open," Nathan replied, standing to leave. "Someone else dug them up for me." He left the sheriff's office with a new resolve. This was no longer just about retrieving a stolen piece of silver. It was about uncovering a truth he had unknowingly been running from for 7 years. He didn't know it yet, but as he rode away from the relative safety of town, he was riding toward a confrontation that would force him to face not just Silas Kane, but the man he himself had been. Days turned into a week. Nathan fell back into the rigid routine of ranch work, but it was a hollow pantomime. He spent his waking hours scanning the horizon, every dust devil a potential rider, every coyote's cry a possible warning. The nights were worse, filled with fragmented dreams of Black Creek, the scent of rain, and Sarah's sorrowful eyes. He was a man suspended in waiting a coiled spring of rage and confusion. It was on one such evening, as dusk settled like a purple bruise over the land, that the waiting ended. He was heading back to the cabin from the barn when he saw her, a figure staggering out of the twilight, moving with a desperate, lurching gait. As she drew closer, he saw she was a woman impossibly tall, her dark hair a tangled mess, her deerskin dress torn and stained. She collapsed near his water trough, her body finally surrendering to an exhaustion so profound it was painful to watch. Nathan approached cautiously, his hand resting on the butt of his revolver. Her breathing was ragged, a harsh tearing sound in the quiet air. She was Apache, that much was clear, but she was alone and wounded. He saw the dark, ugly bruises on her arms, the raw, bleeding scrapes on her bare feet. She had run a long, hard way. He knelt beside her, offering his canteen. "Water," he said, his voice low. She flinched at his closeness, but took the canteen, her eyes dark, intelligent, and filled with a fierce, defiant pride, never leaving his face. She drank deeply, then pushed herself into a sitting position, her movements stiff with pain. "They are coming," she rasped, her voice rough. "Who's coming?" "The men I ran from," she said, her English measured and clear-colored by the cadence of her own tongue. "The man with the scarred face. He calls himself Kane." The name landed like a physical blow. The fight he had been waiting for had just walked onto his land. He helped her to her feet, her towering frame leaning heavily against him. She was taller than him by a head, a giantess forged in the crucible of this harsh land, but right now she was just a woman at the end of her strength. He led her into the cabin, the same cabin that had been his sanctuary and his prison. As he lit the lamp, its golden light filled the small space, pushing back the shadows. He looked at her, truly looked at her, and saw not just a victim, but a survivor. Her spirit, though battered, was unbroken. "My name is Yana," she said, her voice gaining strength. "Nathan," he replied. He gave her food and a blanket. She ate with a focused intensity, then inspected the cabin with a sweeping gaze, assessing its defenses, its exits. She was not just seeking shelter. She was seeking a place to make a stand. She finally looked at him, her dark eyes seeming to pierce right through the walls he'd built around himself. "He is hunting you," she stated. It wasn't a question. "I know." Yana nodded slowly. She gestured to the single bed, then to the floor by the stove, where he had set out a blanket for her. "The ground holds me," she said, her voice firm. "You take the bed. Your fight is coming." In her words, Nathan heard an echo of his own fate. Her arrival was not a coincidence. She was a messenger, a living embodiment of the violence Silas Kane trailed in his wake. And as he looked at this formidable woman who had defied Kane and survived, he felt the first flicker of something other than grief and rage. It was a sliver of hope, sharp and dangerous. He was no longer waiting for the battle alone. The following day broke cold and clear. A fragile truce settled over the cabin, woven from shared silence and watchful eyes. Yana moved with a painful grace, her bruised body a testament to her ordeal. But her spirit remained unyielding. Nathan watched as she mended the tears in her dress with a bone needle and thread from his kit, her stitches small and precise. She was a woman accustomed to making do, to fixing what was broken. He spent the morning reinforcing the cabin door and checking his rifle, the familiar weight a cold comfort in his hands. He knew Kane's men would not be far behind. Yana's escape was an insult Kane would not tolerate. The attack came just after midday, not with a thunder of hooves, but with stealth. 2 men creeping through the sparse cover of the scrub brush that dotted the valley. Nathan spotted them from the barn loft, his old scout's instinct screaming a warning. They were professionals moving with a hunter's patience. He slipped back to the cabin, his heart pounding a steady martial rhythm against his ribs. 2 of them, he said in a low voice to Yana, coming from the east. She didn't panic. Her eyes went hard and she picked up the heavy iron poker from beside the stove, testing its weight. "They will try the back window first," she said. "It is out of sight from the trail." Nathan was taken aback by her tactical assessment. She was right. He had positioned himself to watch the front of the most obvious approach. He moved to the rear of the cabin, pressing himself against the wall beside the small window, his rifle ready. Yana took up a position near the front door, the poker held like a warrior's club. They were a strange pair, a haunted rancher and a towering Apache woman united against a common foe. The minutes stretched into an eternity. The only sound was the sigh of the wind, then a faint scrape of a boot on stone from outside the back window. A shadow fell across the opening. Nathan held his breath. A face appeared bearded and grimy, peering into the dim interior. Nathan didn't hesitate. He swung the butt of his rifle in a short, brutal arc connecting with the man's temple. The man grunted, his eyes rolling back in his head as he crumpled silently to the ground. One, Nathan breathed. A shout came from the front of the cabin. "Abel." What was that? The second man was rushing the front door. Yana was ready. As the door burst inward, splintering from a heavy kick, she swung the poker. It connected with the man's shoulder with a sickening crunch of bone. He roared in pain, staggering back his pistol, firing wildly into the ceiling. Nathan was already moving, diving through the open doorway, tackling the injured outlaw before he could recover. They rolled in the dirt, a desperate tangle of limbs. The man was strong, fueled by pain and rage, his fingers clawing for Nathan's eyes. Nathan drove his elbow into the man's throat, silencing his curses. He wrenched the man's pistol from his grasp and brought the heavy barrel down hard against his skull. The man went limp. Silence descended, broken only by their ragged breathing. Nathan got to his feet, the pistol still in his hand. Yana stood in the doorway, the poker held ready, her chest rising and falling. A bond had been forged between them, not of words, but of violence shared and survived. He knelt beside the second man, checking his pockets. He found a few coins, a half-empty flask of whiskey, and something else. A small, tarnished brass button stamped with the insignia of the 7th Cavalry, his old unit. He stared at it, a cold dread seeping into his bones. These weren't just hired guns. They were connected to his past. As he rolled the man over, a small, faded tintype photograph fell from his breast pocket. He picked it up. It showed 4 men in cavalry uniforms, squinting against the sun. 3 he didn't recognize. The 4th, standing slightly apart from the others, was a younger, unscarred Elias Vance. And standing beside him with a hand on his shoulder and a confident grin on his face was a younger Nathan Cole. The sight of it hit him like a physical blow. Silas Kane Elias wasn't just sending men after him. He was sending ghosts. He was sending pieces of their shared history to tear him apart before the final confrontation. Yana came to stand beside him, her tall frame casting a shadow over the fallen man. She looked from the photograph in his hand to his pale, shaken face. "This is more than a hunch," she said, her voice quiet but certain. "This is a memory he wants you to bleed from." Nathan knew she was right. Silas wasn't just coming to kill him. He was coming to make him remember. And Nathan was beginning to understand that the truth of what happened at Black Creek was something far more terrible than a simple ambush. The victory felt hollow, the 2 unconscious outlaws a mere prelude. The real storm had yet to break. The discovery of the photograph shifted everything. The conflict was no longer a force of nature Nathan had to endure. It was a puzzle he had to solve. He couldn't wait for Silas to bring the war to his doorstep again. He had to take the fight to him to understand the why that fueled such deep-seated hatred. "I have to go," he told Yana the next morning, the 2 outlaws now bound and gagged in his small root cellar. "I need answers. There's a town west of here, Harmony, a place where information is traded like currency. I think I can learn more about Kane's movements there." Yana looked at him, her gaze unwavering. "You will leave me here alone." "You won't be alone," he said, gesturing to his rifle leaning against the wall. "And you're more capable of defending this place than I am. Barricade the door. Keep watch from the loft. Don't light a lamp after sundown." He paused, meeting her eyes. "You know how to use this?" he asked, nodding to the rifle. A grim smile touched her lips. My people did not survive by asking for permission to fight. He believed her. He left her with the rifle, a pistol, and most of their ammunition. As he rode away, he looked back to see her tall silhouette in the doorway of the cabin, a sentinel watching over his home. For the first time, he wasn't just leaving a piece of property behind. He was leaving someone he trusted to protect it. While Nathan rode west, Yana transformed the ranch into a fortress. She was not a passive damsel awaiting rescue. She was a warrior preparing her ground. She used her knowledge of the land, her understanding of traps and snares born from a life of survival. She dug a shallow pit obscured with brush on the main path to the cabin. She loosened boards in the barn loft, creating a deadfall that could be triggered by a single rope. She moved with a quiet, deadly purpose, her grief and anger channeled into a cold, practical fury. The ranch was no longer Nathan's sanctuary. It was her battleground, and she would make it a graveyard for any who dared to trespass. Nathan, meanwhile, arrived in Harmony. It was a town that lived up to its name only in irony, a grimy, desperate outpost teetering on the edge of the lawless territories. It was a haven for prospectors, deserters, and men running from their pasts. Men like him. His first stop was a trading post run by a grizzled man named Jedediah, whose business was information as much as it was dry goods. Silas Kane, Jedediah grunted, wiping the counter with a dirty rag. That's a name best left unspoken. He and his crew are bad medicine. They don't just rob, they settle scores. Been cutting a bloody swath through this territory for the last year. What kind of scores? Nathan pressed, sliding a silver dollar across the counter. The trader's eyes lit up. He pocketed the coin. The strange kind. Last month they hit a stagecoach. Didn't take the payroll, just a single passenger. An old retired quartermaster from Fort Grant. Left him out in the desert. 2 weeks before that, they burned down a homesteader's ranch north of here. Man used to be a corporal in the cavalry. A pattern was emerging, cold and terrifying. Fort Grant, the 7th Cavalry. Silas was hunting their old unit. Do you know where they're based? Nathan asked. Jedediah shook his head. They move like the wind. But I hear they pay well for supplies, especially medical stuff. There's a retired army doctor, old man Abernathy, who lives on the edge of town. He patches up anyone who can pay no questions asked. If Kane's men have been through here, Abernathy would know. Nathan found Dr. Abernathy in a dusty, cluttered office that smelled of carbolic acid and regret. The doctor was old, his hands trembling with age, but his eyes were still sharp. He was reluctant to talk at first, but Nathan's mention of the 7th Cavalry and Black Creek broke through his caution. I was the surgeon at Fort Grant back then, Abernathy said, his voice a dry rasp. I remember that patrol. A disaster. Officially, it was an Apache ambush. But there were whispers. Whispers about what Nathan urged. Abernathy hesitated, looking toward the door, as if expecting ghosts to walk through it. That the patrol wasn't just a patrol. That your commanding officer, Captain Wallace, was using it as cover. He was a man with expensive tastes and a gambler's appetite. The rumors were he was moving Army property, new rifles, ammunition to sell to miners, or worse. The pieces began to click into place, forming a picture far uglier than Nathan had imagined. Elias Vance, Nathan said the name, feeling strange on his tongue. He was on that patrol. Did you know him? Sergeant Vance. Of course. A fine man. Devoted to his family, the doctor said sadly. His wife and daughter were at the fort. They left a week after the massacre. Said they were going back east. I never saw them again. Nathan's mind was reeling. A corrupt officer, a weapons deal, an ambush that was too perfect, too complete. He pushed the old tintype photograph across the desk. This man, Silas Kane. Have you seen him? Dr. Abernathy picked up the photo, his trembling hands holding it close to his spectacles. He stared at the face of Elias Vance. My God, he whispered, his face draining of color. A few months ago, a man came to me. A gunshot wound in his side. He paid in gold. He had this same face, but with a terrible scar. He asked me questions about Captain Wallace, about the Black Creek report, about you, Mr. Cole. Abernathy looked up, his eyes wide with a dawning horror. He said his name was Kane, but it was him. It was Sergeant Vance. He's alive. The confirmation hit Nathan like a physical blow, knocking the air from his lungs. Elias was alive. The quiet friend he had mourned was now a scarred phantom bent on revenge. The quest for a stolen locket had become a desperate race to understand a 7-year-old betrayal. His guilt, once a vague, shapeless thing, now had a name and a face. He had failed to save his friend at Black Creek, and now that failure had returned armed and seeking retribution. He had to get back to Yana. He had to prepare for the arrival of a ghost who believed Nathan Cole was the devil himself. The ride back to the ranch was a frantic, desperate gallop against the setting sun. The truth Abernathy had revealed was a fire in Nathan's gut. Elias Vance was alive. His friend, the man he thought had died by his side, was the architect of his current nightmare. The questions multiplied with every beat of his horse's hooves. If Elias had survived, why had he disappeared? Why had he returned now as a ruthless killer? And what was Nathan's role in the tragedy of Black Creek that had so twisted the soul of a good man? He found the ranch quiet, bathed in the eerie light of a rising moon. But it was a coiled, watchful quiet. As he approached a low whistle, a signal they had agreed upon, came from the barn loft. He whistled back, and a moment later, Yana emerged from the shadows, the rifle held at a low ready. "You are back," she said, her voice betraying a hint of relief. "He's alive," Nathan said, swinging down from his horse. "The man Silas Kane. His real name is Elias Vance. He was a sergeant in my unit. He was my friend." He explained everything he had learned from Abernathy, the corrupt Captain Wallace, the illegal weapons deal, and the whispers that Black Creek was more than just a random ambush. Yana listened intently, her dark eyes missing nothing. "Then this captain is the one he should be hunting," she said. "Wallace died of a fever in a San Francisco hotel 3 years ago," Nathan said grimly. "Whatever justice Elias wants, he's decided I'm the one who has to pay the price for it." He felt a profound sense of dread. Elias wasn't just coming for him. He was coming for everything he had. The ranch, Yana. He was methodically dismantling Nathan's world just as his had been dismantled. The next move came 2 days later. It was not a direct assault. It was something far more cunning, far more cruel. A lone rider approached the ranch, carrying a white flag of truce. It was Sheriff Miller, his face pale and drawn, his hands bound in front of him, a rope around his neck held by one of Silas's men. Silas himself sat on a black stallion just beyond the fence line, a silhouette of vengeance against the harsh morning sun. He had removed his mask. The scarred face was a twisted caricature of the friend Nathan remembered. Cole Silas's voice boomed across the valley, sharp and clear. "I grow tired of this game. I have your friend, the good sheriff, a man of the law about to be broken by it." Nathan stood on the porch, his rifle in his hands, Yana, a tall, silent shadow beside him. "Let him go, Elias." Nathan shouted back, using the name for the first time. A flicker of something pain memory crossed Silas's face. "That man is dead. He died in the mud at Black Creek, along with everything he ever cared for. You will meet me, Cole, alone, at the old fort. Sundown tomorrow. The fort where our unit was stationed, the place where the lies began. You will come alone, or the sheriff dies. And then your Apache whore dies. And then I will burn this pathetic little shrine you've built to your own guilt to the ground." He held up a familiar object, dangling it from his fingers so it caught the morning light, the silver locket. "Come and get it," Silas taunted. "Come back to where it all started." He and his men wheeled their horses and rode away, dragging the helpless Sheriff Miller with them. They left Nathan with an impossible choice. He was being summoned to a reckoning at the very heart of his trauma, forced to walk back into the ruins of his past. The stakes were no longer just his own life or the memory of his wife. An innocent man's life hung in the balance. Silas had isolated him, stripping away his defenses and leaving him with nothing but a path that led straight back into the darkness he had spent 7 years trying to escape. The air grew heavy and thick as Nathan rode toward the ruins of Fort Sheridan, the sky above him churning with bruised purple clouds. A storm was brewing both in the heavens and in his soul. The fort was a skeleton on the horizon, its broken walls like jagged teeth against the darkening sky. This was where he had trained, where he had laughed with Elias, where he had last seen Sarah alive before riding out on that fateful patrol. Every stone seemed to hold a memory, every gust of wind a whisper of accusation. He left his horse at the base of the hill and approached the crumbling gate on foot, his rifle held ready. The place was unnervingly silent, save for the rising moan of the wind. He found Sheriff Miller tied to a post in the center of the old parade ground, conscious but weakened. "He's up there," Miller rasped, nodding toward the shattered remains of the commander's office on the second floor of the main barracks. "It's a trap, Nathan. He's not alone." "I know," Nathan said, cutting the sheriff's bonds. "Get out of here. Take my horse and ride. Don't stop." "What about you?" "This is my fight," Nathan said, pushing a pistol into the sheriff's hand. "Go." As Miller scrambled away into the growing gloom, the first drops of rain began to fall fat and cold. A bolt of lightning split the sky, illuminating the fort in a stark, ghostly flash. In that brief, brilliant moment, Nathan saw him, Silas, standing in the gaping window frame of the office, a specter watching his approach. Nathan entered the barracks, the stench of decay and wet earth filling his lungs. He climbed the rickety stairs, each step groaning in protest. The wind howled through the broken walls, tearing at the remnants of the roof. He reached the top floor and stepped into the cavernous office. Silas stood by the window, his back to him, looking out at the storm. The silver locket was in his hand. "I remember this room," Silas said, his voice quiet, almost conversational, yet carrying over the roar of the wind. "This is where Captain Wallace gave us our orders. A simple scouting mission, he called it. A lie to send us to our graves." "Elias, I never knew." Nathan began, his voice strained. "About Wallace, about the guns." "Didn't you?" Silas spun around his face, a mask of fury, the scar livid in the flashes of lightning. "Or did you just choose not to see Wallace paid you well for your silence, didn't he? A bonus for your exemplary service. Blood money, Cole. You were his favorite scout because you never asked questions." The rain was coming down in sheets, now sluicing through the broken roof and turning the floor to mud. Thunder cracked directly overhead, shaking the very foundations of the ruined building. "That's not true?" Nathan protested, his mind reeling. "Isn't it?" Silas took a step closer, his eyes burning with a mad fire. "Wallace needed the ambush to look real. He needed a witness, a survivor, to sell his story. He chose you to live." "He didn't choose," Nathan shot back. "I was lucky." "There was no luck at Black Creek," Silas roared. "Only betrayal. I wasn't just a soldier in your unit, Cole. I was your friend. I trusted you. So I told you my secret, that my wife Elena and my little girl Rosa were traveling with me, hidden in a supply wagon. They were going to meet me at the next settlement. We were starting a new life. I told you, and only you." The blood drained from Nathan's face. He remembered now. Elias confessing his plan in a hushed whisper the night before they rode out. A secret shared between friends. When the shooting started, Silas continued, his voice cracking with a grief that was still raw. After 7 years, it wasn't a random Apache attack. It was Wallace's buyer's cleaning house. They didn't just hit the patrol. They went straight for that supply wagon. I saw it all. I saw them murder my family. And I saw you, Cole. You weren't fighting. You were taking cover just like Wallace ordered. You let them die. No. Nathan whispered the horror of the memory, the truth of it crashing down on him. He had followed orders. He had stayed down while the real killing happened. They left me for dead, Silas hissed, but I crawled out of that mud. I survived. And when I made it back here, I went to your wife. To Sarah. Nathan's heart stopped. I told her everything. Silas spat his words like acid. I told her about Wallace, about the guns, about your blood money. I told her the man she married was a coward who let my wife and child die for a handful of silver. He took another step, his face inches from Nathan's. Your wife didn't die of consumption, Cole. She died of a broken heart, the grief of knowing who she had married. It ate her alive. She wasted away ashamed to even look at you. That locket you cherish so much, it's a monument to your lies. The final terrible truth fell into place. Sarah's sadness, her distance in those final months. It hadn't been sickness. It had been knowledge. It had been shame. The world narrowed to the space between them, a vortex of rain, wind, and shattered history. This wasn't about revenge anymore. It was about judgment. Elias raised his pistol. Nathan raised his. The storm raged around them, a symphony for two damned souls. They fired at the same time. A searing pain blossomed in Nathan's shoulder, spinning him around. His own shot went wide. Elias charged, not firing again, but tackling him, driving him through the rotten wall and out onto a narrow, crumbling balcony. They fell onto the slick, muddy wood, grappling in the heart of the storm. It wasn't a fight of skill, but of raw, desperate agony. A battle for redemption, for absolution, for the right to breathe. Nathan saw the face of his friend twisted by years of hate. And for the first time, he understood. He wasn't fighting a villain. He was fighting a man he had broken. With a surge of strength, born of guilt and despair, Nathan twisted, rolling them toward the edge of the balcony. The rotten railing splintered and gave way. For a brief second, they were suspended in the air, two figures locked in a final tragic embrace before plunging into the churning mud below. The world returned in fragments of pain and the cold, clinging embrace of mud. Nathan lay on his back, the storm's fury lessening to a steady, weeping drizzle. His shoulder was a nexus of agony, and every breath was a struggle. A few feet away, Elias Vance lay still, his eyes open and vacant, staring up at the unforgiving sky. A dark stain was spreading across his chest. In his outstretched hand, gleaming in the mud, was the silver locket. Nathan crawled toward him, his body screaming in protest. He reached his fallen friend, his brother, in arms, and closed his eyes. He took the locket, its cold metal a dead weight in his palm. The fight was over. The hate was spent. All that remained was the hollow ache of the truth. He must have lost consciousness, because the next thing he knew, a gentle hand was on his face and a voice was calling his name. He opened his eyes to see Yana kneeling over him, her expression a mixture of fear and relief. She had followed him. She had come for him. With her help, he staggered back to the cabin. The journey was a blur of pain, but her strength was an anchor in the storm of his agony. She cleaned and bandaged his wound, her touch firm and sure. She did not ask what had happened. She seemed to already know. In the quiet, flickering lamplight of the cabin, with the storm finally past, Nathan Cole confessed everything. He told her about Captain Wallace, the blood money he had blindly accepted, his cowardice at Black Creek, and the terrible truth of Sarah's death. He laid his soul bare, expecting her to turn from him in disgust, to leave him to the ghosts he so richly deserved. When he finished, the silence in the room was absolute. Yana looked at him, her dark eyes holding not condemnation, but a profound and sorrowful understanding. She had faced her own demons, had been brutalized by the cruelty of men. She knew the landscape of pain and regret. "The past is a ghost that feeds on silence," she said softly. "You have starved it tonight." She reached out and took his hand. "I do not offer you forgiveness. That is not mine to give. But I will not leave you to face the morning alone." Her words were not absolution, but something far more valuable: companionship on the long road ahead. The next day, he rode into redemption, his arm in a sling, his face a mask of grim resolve. He walked into Sheriff Miller's office and told him the entire story, providing the names, the dates, and the details of Captain Wallace's gun-running operation. He held nothing back, fully prepared to face the consequences. He wasn't just a vigilante. He was a witness, finally giving voice to the crimes that had destroyed so many lives. His testimony would not bring back Elias or his family, but it was a final act of justice, a penance offered not for his own salvation, but in memory of the friend he had failed. Months later, autumn painted the valley in shades of gold and amber. The scar on Nathan's shoulder had faded to a pale white line, a permanent reminder of his reckoning. Life had found a new rhythm, one of quiet purpose. He was building an extension onto the cabin, the fresh sawn pines smelling of promise. The small homestead was no longer a place of exile, but a place of growth. Yana stood in the doorway, her hands resting on the gentle swell of her belly. She was pregnant, carrying the future within her. They worked together, a partnership forged in violence and tempered by a shared hope. The past was not forgotten, but it no longer held them captive. One afternoon, as Nathan prepared to lay the foundation stones for the new room, he took the silver locket from his pocket. He had carried it with him since that night at the fort, a constant, heavy weight. He looked at the faded image of Sarah, his first love, a woman whose memory was now free from the taint of his lies. He felt a pang of sorrow, but it was a clean grief, unburdened by guilt. He knelt and placed the locket into the foundation trench, nestled between two large stones. He was not erasing Sarah's memory, but making it a cornerstone. He was burying the haunted relic of his past to build a foundation for their future. As he stood up, Yana came to him, her hand finding his. She looked toward the distant mountains, where the last of the afternoon sun was catching the peaks. "Sheriff Miller sent word," she said quietly. "They arrested a man in San Francisco based on your testimony. A wealthy shipping merchant. He was Captain Wallace's business partner." Nathan nodded, a quiet finality settling over him. "The sheriff told me his name." Yana continued, turning to face him. Her eyes held a new light, one of shared victory. "I knew him. He was one of the men who oversaw the trade that led to my capture. He grew rich on the suffering of my people." Nathan stared at her, the final piece of the vast, intricate puzzle falling into place. Their paths had not crossed by chance. They were two survivors of the same sprawling web of corruption and greed, two souls drawn together by a shared enemy they had together brought to justice. He pulled her close, his arm wrapping around her, his hand resting protectively over their unborn child. They stood together, looking out at the land stretching before them. It was the same land, the same harsh and beautiful country, but it no longer felt like a place to hide. It felt like home. They were no longer defined by their scars, but by the future they were building together, a future rooted in truth, watered by grace, and bathed in the promise of a new dawn.